Добрий день. Я такий приємно бути тут з вами сьогодні ще раз. It's a pleasure to be with you here in Ukraine, despite circumstances that are extremely tragic for the country, for Europe, and for the international community. Since the time that I had the honor to serve here as the U.S. ambassador, I've had many different opportunities, and today I have the opportunity to be Secretary Kerry's Special Representative and Special Envoy on energy issues, and in charge of the Energy Bureau at the State Department. The reason that I am here today with a team of my colleagues from the State Department, from USAID, the Department of Energy, is to work together with our Ukrainian counterparts on the energy security of Ukraine. We've had a working group on energy security with Ukraine for some period of time. Today we meet in extraordinary circumstances. But even given the crisis situation that Ukraine has faced, with its national territory being violated by another country, we still had an opportunity and found it critical to understand what the vision can be for the long term. Ukraine is a country of huge resources, including tremendous energy resources. The potential for Ukraine to increase its existing production of gas, which is about 20 billion cubic meters a year, is quite extensive. Perhaps it could increase that production by another 30% over the next 5 years. Ukraine's ability to produce more gas is also quite extensive, based on contracts that it signed at the end of last year with companies like Chevron, Shell, and Eni. And these international companies are committed to work with Ukrainians to develop the resources here for the future. If, as a result of these increases in production from the existing wells, from new fields, which could add another 20 billion cubic meters, if Ukraine has the capacity to develop with its Western neighbors a greater flow of gas supplies from a new European gas market that can bring supplies to Ukraine from the West, potentially by the year 2020, Ukraine can be in a situation with a lot of focus on energy efficiency as well. It can be in a situation where it is self-reliant on gas. And that is a historic moment, that would be a historic moment for this country. We talked about the steps in this working group together with the Minister of Energy, Yuri Prodno, the steps that need to be taken for Ukraine to create these incentives for its domestic production, to continue to incentivize the development of new production. We also focused attention on the diversification of supplies. Today, Ukraine has the opportunity to import gas from its neighbors in Poland and Hungary, using supplies that originate in Central Europe. There are discussions that are continuing with Slovakia to look at how flows could come from Slovakia back into Ukraine. Just yesterday, there was a European delegation, or Ukrainian delegation that was in Brussels, led by Minister Prodno, discussing what kinds of measures can take place to ensure that these reverse flows can work and where the supplies can actually come from. Together with all of this is the importance, I think, that Ukraine and its international partners continue to place on energy efficiency. It's absolutely key for the country to have the incentives to be able to use the energy resources that it has most effectively. Because in the end, this is a critical tool for people to pay less for the energy that they consume if they simply can consume less of it. And so we talked about what kinds of incentives can make that possible over time. This is a long-term process of transition. It takes careful, calibrated work. It requires investment from the private sector, but it's also an agenda that's doable. And that's what we were trying to focus on that now. Focusing and creating and driving a doable agenda that can be realized by Ukraine to be able to bring to Ukraine as a country the energy security that it deserves, to bring to the people the access to the supplies that they need to have a good life, to be able to give businesses the kind of access on a regular basis, on a competitive basis, that can make those businesses competitive in a European and global market. So I'm pleased to answer your questions and address whatever thoughts you might have.
Okay. Well, we have a first question here, but this is for translation, channel 3 is in English.
Информационное агентство «Интерфакс Украина».
Can you
Okay. Интерфакс Украины, Игорь Соловей. Вместе с оккупацией России Крыма российской стране отошел также Черноморнефтегаз, который будет принадлежать уже «Газпрому». Возможно ли какие-то санкции со стороны западных стран именно к «Газпрому» в связи с этим? И сразу возникает вопрос континентального шельфа. Как возможно урегулирование этого вопроса? Спасибо.
As you know, there has not been a recognition on the part of the West of the annexation of Crimea. The actions that will be taken in response to that are still being developed. You saw just a short time ago that the White House and the European Union announced a series of sanctions against Russia. Yesterday, again, the White House announced another set of sanctions. What we have indicated is that these will be incremental over time, responding to the circumstances on the ground. I will not comment on what specific sanctions might be. Those are going to proceed as they are determined and developed together through a process which is led by the White House in the United States. On the questions of the continental shelf and how territory is looked at for the future, this would be premature because it would simply assume that the annexation of Crimea is automatically accepted. These are issues that still need to be addressed and worked out over time.
Another question in the first row.
Hi, Hello. Yeah. Vladimir Lazinski from Al Jazeera, America. The Russians are demanding quite a huge gas bill recently, and a lot of other bills, and there's always the threat of them basically instantly cutting off the gas supply to here. Are there any contingency plans immediately, because what you've talked about is what can happen over a 6-year period. You use the 2020 as your benchmark for independence on this. Are there any contingency plans that can do this in the short term if Russia cuts that gas off?
Well, I think the first thing is to lay out the scenario that we all hope that Russia will adhere to, and that it will see that it is in its commercial interest and self-interest to be seen as a reliable supplier of gas to the European market. And in order to do that in today's marketplace, utilizing the transit system through Ukraine is an absolutely critical requirement. And in order to be able to satisfy the demands of its customers throughout Central Europe, throughout Western Europe, Russia has an opportunity to be able to utilize the supply routes that exist and to continue to supply gas that would also come to Ukraine. In the end, this is a positive thing for Russia. There are too many different trade-offs that could potentially be unraveled over time. We all know that Crimea, for example, is dependent on Ukraine for 80% of its electricities. These are trade-offs that are not helpful for anybody to have to speculate. So what we hope is that Russia looks at this situation in a way which is clear-cut and is in line with commercial interests. For Ukraine, for its own interest, one of the things that it should do, that any country should do, is to look to diversify supply. That is good advice for Ukraine, it's good advice for every European country, it's good advice for the United States. And it's in that spirit that Ukraine has been working with its neighbors on reverse flows that could come from western parts of Europe into Ukraine. There's a capacity that exists, relatively small, through Poland, another through Hungary, another that's being negotiated and developed through Slovakia. These are not enough to substitute completely for Russian gas, but when you get flows of gas coming from multiple sources, giving you the opportunity to make purchases in different parts of the world, then you have an opportunity that creates competition. It's exactly that kind of competition, for example, that allowed Europe and European companies and utilities to be able to renegotiate their contracts with Gazprom in 2012 because they had the power of the marketplace behind them. So these are some of the kinds of things that are being worked through now. I can't speak for your gas bill in London, but...
We have another question.
Yes.
Jim Hines, Associated Press. To what extent is it credible to think that the United States might help Ukraine diversify its gas supply by increasing or supporting increased LNG shipments and facilities either to Ukraine or to other countries that could then reverse ship the gas to Ukraine?
Well, I think one of the things that we should look at is the issue of LNG supplies in the context of a global marketplace, not just the United States. The United States has already had a huge impact on gas supplies to Europe, not because we were exporting gas, but because we were producing massive amounts of gas that were not planned for in the past. Today, we are importing about 5 billion cubic meters of gas total, only from Canada. It was seen just a few years ago that we would be importing 80. That difference of 75 has been redirected to international markets, coming from places like Qatar and Trinidad and Tobago and Nigeria. In 2012, much of that supply came to the European market and was critical to allowing European utilities to do the kind of renegotiation of their contracts with Gazprom that I mentioned earlier. So, in effect, these supplies are already having a big impact on the marketplace. In the future, the United States has continued to signal that it will participate in the global gas market. We have approved 6 licenses for the export of liquefied natural gas. If those licenses eventually come onto the market, of the supplies that are seen eventually produced under those licenses come onto the market, it will add over time about another 89 billion cubic meters of gas to global markets. But in addition to that, we have to recognize that there is going to be gas coming from other sources. Australia is bringing on major supplies in 2014. Mozambique is bringing on major supplies in the future. Norway has had quite extensive gas finds. There have been very significant gas finds in the Mediterranean. And so the important thing to recognize about this is that the LNG that will be coming onto the marketplace, even though it's not coming onto the market today, is sending a signal about the kind of market that we're going to have in the future. It's one that is competitive across countries where there's an opportunity for suppliers to compete and for consumers to use their market demand in a constructive way to be able to get the best possible price. And so this is not, I can answer this question without even commenting on what speculative future supplies of LNG might be from the United States. One almost doesn't need to, because these dynamics and trends are already on the way. We have seen the impacts already, and we can see that they've been very positive to be able to create a much more competitive environment in the European marketplace, which has diminished the ability of any country to use its market presence for geopolitical purposes.
Ukraine Information Agency.
Дмитро Хилюк, інформагенція Уніан. У мене питання наступне. В Україні поширена думка про те, що зняття ембарго з Ірану дозволить вийти на ринку іранській нафті, і це значно знизить ціни в європейському регіоні, і відповідно це дуже боляче вдарить по Росії. Наскільки такі думки мають рацію і наскільки таке можливо? Дякую.
First of all, the reason that there has been an embargo on Iran has been because of Iranian threat to global security, because of the potential for Iran to use its nuclear capability to develop a nuclear weapon. And so the international community has come together in sanctions against Iran in order to insist the kind of transparency that's necessary to ensure that its nuclear capabilities are used only for peaceful means and not as a threat toward the international community. There are negotiations that are continuing. We want to see those negotiations succeed. But until that happens, there has not been a proposal for relief into the future. Now, to be realistic as well, let's look at the volumes that are involved. The amount of oil which Iran is now exporting to international markets is about 1 million barrels a day. The amount that they have had a capacity to export in the past has been about 2.5 million barrels a day. In effect, over the past 2.5 years, we have taken 1.5 million barrels of oil off of the international market from Iran. If you compare the price of oil today at $105, $106 a barrel for Brent crude, and if you look at January of 2012, where the price of oil was about exactly the same, one can see that we have done this in a way that has allowed a smooth transition with new supplies coming onto the market and not causing a disruption to consumers. What that tells us is that people should not be overly exuberant about what the impact might be if Iranian oil or other additional oil came onto the market. The marketplace is going to balance itself, and what we have to recognize is that balancing is a factor of supply and demand. And if producers are not getting the returns that they need on their supplies, they're not going to put the oil into the marketplace. So let's look at this with a clear perspective, and let's also recognize that as we move from January 2012 to today, there's actually been very little impact on global oil prices over the last 2+ years.
Do we have more questions? One more? Yeah, sure.
There's been a threat to nationalize Gazprom's assets here in the Ukraine. If there's a tit for tat, how does that affect the energy market? And how does that affect any of, I would say, Ukrainian or then American assets in Russia?
As you might imagine, I won't speculate about what might specifically happen here in Ukraine or in Russia or in any other country as a result of sanctions. The sanctions that were imposed by the United States and Europe were specifically intended to make a statement about an act of security and politics which is in contravention of international law. And it was intended specifically for that purpose. And our hope is that the demonstration of condemnation by the international community for that action will have the intended effect that will demonstrate to Russia that this is an action that cannot be tolerated and that further action on their part should not be taken. Our commitment is to try to move forward to a situation where Ukraine can have the greatest security that it can have over its country, its politics, and its resources, and to be able to do that without outside interference. And so, from the energy sector perspective, the reason that we're here is to look at both the short-term measures that can help create an assurance of supply, that can create a diversification of options, the long-term options that are critical to be able to increase supply in the future, and to understand the kinds of measures that are important in energy policy, in energy efficiency, to be able to create the bridge between today and that future period of production that allows this country to have the transition that it needs to a viable, competitive energy economy that really supports and underpins the economic competitiveness of Ukraine and addresses the needs of its people.
You don't have any further questions? No. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for your time and for presence with us. Thank you.
Thank you.